So after the most recent developer livestream for Season 3 of Diablo 4, I'm much more excited for the Seneschal companion that we're getting because of some of the possibilities that they showed off in that developer livestream. So I wanted to go over most of the governing and tuning stones, but before that, I wanted to go over the thing they actually showed in the livestream that made me pretty excited. So if you don't know the basics of how the companion is actually going to work, you get this Seneschal companion that's going to follow you around, and you'll be able to customize it with governing stones, which are teaching it new abilities, and tuning stones, which modify those abilities. So on your Seneschal, you'll be able to give it 2 governing stones, so 2 different abilities, and each one of those abilities will have 3 tuning stone slots. So you'll be able to put 3 augments on both of those abilities, and it seems like both governing and tuning stones will be able to be leveled up to level 10. So they start at level 1 up to level 10, and there's going to be quite a lot of governing stones and tuning stones. But one of the examples they gave during the live stream seemed to be incredibly exciting. So they showed off one of the governing stones for the Seneschal, which is Focus Fire. The Seneschal construct channels a ray of fire onto targets, dealing damage to each of them over time. And this would be fire damage. I'm not sure if this would be considered specifically fire dot damage, and if it would proc other passive effects that would require a fire dot to be on that target if they're currently channeling. But when they added some tuning stones to this ability, it got pretty crazy. Now we don't know at a base how many different targets this ray of fire is going to hit for the Focus Fire governing stone, but we do know that they mixed this governing stone with the arcing support stone, which is the supported skill can hit additional enemies. And we've seen this leveled up to level 10, which means it can hit 11 additional enemies. So I think the governing stone probably at base is going to hit probably around like 3 targets and then 11 extra on top of that. So you're going to have this fire beam hitting like a dozen plus enemies on your screen. And then the developers also mentioned that you can add additional elemental tuning stones to this attack, which will apply different elemental effects to everything it hits. So the base governing stone is already doing fire damage. And again, we don't know if that's specifically going to be considered a fire dot, but then you could say add something dusk support. A portion of the supported skill's damage dealt is applied as shadow damage over time. Afflicted enemies who attack have a chance for their attacks to be interrupted. So this is basically adding shadow damage effect to this big fire beam that now could potentially be hitting a dozen plus enemies. Now the specific elemental tuning stone they showed off was electrocution support. A portion of the supported skill's damage dealt is applied as lightning damage and has a chance to stun enemies. And I think the reason they were showing this is because if your little Seneschal is hitting like a dozen plus enemies with fire damage, then you're also adding lightning damage on top of that can also stun. You could potentially have a pretty strong AoE stun effect because it's constantly hitting all these enemies for damage over time that can all apply a stun for every damage proc, meaning you're getting a ton of lightning and fire damage that are all just constantly proccing, giving all those procs a chance to also stun. Now we don't know if you're going to be able to apply multiple elemental tuning stones to this fire ability, because the super exciting possibility with this is that you're using this ability that does fire damage to all these targets, you apply the modifier so it hits 11 more targets, then you apply the tuning stone that say does electric damage, then you apply the tuning stone that say does cold damage. So now you could do fire, lightning, and cold, and the cold would apply chill, and the lightning would be able to apply stun. So there's a possibility that your Seneschal could just be hitting your entire screen with like 3 different elemental damage types. And they did show off some other skills, and they showed how it interacts with some different tuning stones, and different abilities I think are going to have very different interactions with the same tuning stones. I think there's going to be a ridiculous amount of augments you can do with this system. And keep in mind, we already know that the Seneschal is going to scale with your player stats 1-to-1. So any amount of damage increase, your crit chance, your crit damage, all those type of stats are going to scale directly to your Seneschal, meaning your Seneschal's damage is actually going to be really good. And I think a lot of people were thinking that later in the game, you would just apply all the support stones and your Seneschal would just be like a walking support for you and really wouldn't be that interesting. But I think with it scaling 1-to-1 with you and some of the crazy stuff that we've been shown, I think the Seneschal is actually going to be pretty crazy for damage as well. Now, because there's so many governing and tuning stones, I don't want to go over every single one, but I do want to go over all the governing stones. There's a lot less of those. And I do want to go over some more exciting examples for the tuning stones. So for the governing stones, which are the specific abilities you can teach your Seneschal, we have auto defense. Your Seneschal activates an anti-material field around itself, shooting down enemy projectiles, cannot shoot down boss or player projectiles. This is going to be a really big defensive ability. You could also like increase sides with tuning stones, so you'll just be knocking down all projectiles, could be pretty good for defensive. You have bushwhack, quickly ambush, dealing damage to each target, may strike the same target multiple times. This could potentially be incredibly strong damage, especially on a boss, because you're just hitting the same target a ton of different times. Mixing this in with, say, different elemental tuning stones, you could apply a ton of different elemental effects very quickly. Then we have Firefly, deploy a small construct that lands on the target and explodes it 3 times, dealing damage. Don't know how good that's going to be. It sounds like it's going to be more of like a burst AoE ability. Then we have Focus Fire, the Seneschal construct channels a ray of fire into targets, dealing damage over time. That's the ability we went over. Then we have Gyrate, the Seneschal construct whirls its legs around, dealing damage to all surrounding enemies, so basically whirlwinding. Then we have Impale, perform a line attack to enemies in front of the Seneschal, dealing damage. And an ability like this sounds like it could potentially do a lot more damage than the others because it's kind of a weird ability to get off, and you probably won't be able to directly control your Seneschal as much as we'd want. This could potentially be a more hit or miss higher damage ability. Then we have Lightning Bolt, launch a lightning bolt at the target, dealing damage. Arcs to other targets, dealing a portion of the original damage. Now what we also saw with this is that if you apply some of the other tuning stone that gives more projectiles, this will basically just make a fan of lightning bolts in front of the Seneschal. So instead of it machine gunning lightning bolts one after the other at the same spot, it basically just makes a big cone of lightning bolts in front of it. And that could also be really good if you're doing some sort of lightning build, because all those lightning bolts are also going to arc to different targets. So you could potentially be shooting out like 12 lightning bolts in front of the Seneschal that can all hit a target, then all arc to other targets. That, depending on how it synergizes with some of the player passives, could potentially get pretty crazy. Then we have Protect. The construct materializes a protective barrier on the player for a portion of their max life. Just a big barrier, but if you need more defensive, that can be really good. Reconstruct. The construct channels a healing beam on the player for a portion of their max life. If you need more healing, you can use this. I feel like this one is probably not going to really be used because most builds in the game have a lot of healing. It's usually the super big damage burst or the one shots that kill you. We have Slash, pummel enemies in front of the Seneschal, dealing damage. We have Tempest, electrically charge an enemy, causing it to deal damage to themselves and additional enemies each second over time. If the enemy is killed, Tempest spreads to another enemy, gaining additional time and bonus damage. These bonuses are also applied if Tempest is reapplied onto the same enemy. So this sounds pretty strong. I think it sounds stronger for AoE situations, but if you got a really low cooldown tuning stone, your Seneschal could potentially be constantly reapplying this to a boss, constantly stacking up its damage, so you could potentially see something on really long boss fights where this would be good as well. Then finally, we have Flash of Adrenaline. Administer a quick flash of adrenaline into the player, granting bonus damage for a duration. Now, depending on how this one is balanced, it's either going to be probably not good, or it's going to be so good it's basically required to be one of your Seneschal abilities. That's really all depending on how much damage it actually does, and that actually depends on if that damage is multiplicative or not, because if that's a multiplicative scaler, you could just get like cooldown reduction tuning stones, buff tuning stones, tons of other stuff, and just get some massive damage increase. Now, one of the most exciting parts about the tuning stones for the Seneschal is that there's actually going to be 2 unique tuning stones that are much stronger than the other ones. We already know one of them. So both these unique tuning stones are going to be Evernight and Genesis. We don't know what Genesis is, but we know what Evernight is. So Evernight is one of the unique tuning stones, and this supported skill grants you +4 to all skills when used for 2 seconds. So this is an augment to one of your Seneschal's governing abilities, so one of their actual usable abilities, and this will grant you +4 to all skills for 2 seconds after they use it. So this is giving you pretty much the same thing that Shackle gives you, +4 to every skill, but we don't know how this is going to be when leveled up, because remember, you can level these all up to level 10. Presumably, leveling this up is just going to increase its duration from 2 up to probably 10 to 12 seconds. Now, if it also continues to increase the plus skill ranks on this is going to be absolutely absurd, but if it only upgrades the duration, it's still going to be really good actually, because you also have other tuning stones like Tactical Support, which reduces the cooldown of the supported skill. Now, if you max rank Tactical Support, so your Seneschal has a really low cooldown on one of their abilities, you then put a max rank Evernight on that ability, you could potentially have +4 ranks to all of your skills for the entirety of the time you're in combat, depending on how the numbers line up. But I do think that's going to actually be possible. And then if you think about adding +4 ranks to all skills, then you get something like a Shaco, which adds another +4 rank to all skills. Just these 2 things would give you +8 ranks. And I think people have already been able to get +30 or close to +30 on certain skills in the game. So you could potentially add even more on top top of that, and you may be able to get some ridiculous plus to skill rank for certain skills, which could be incredibly strong. So I'm very excited to see what the other unique tuning stone, which is Genesis, is actually going to be. Now, because you're able to put 3 different tuning stones to augment one of the governing stones, there's some potentially pretty crazy combinations besides the one we already went over. Now, the first thing I recognize is that there are 3 different tuning stones that seem like they do similar things that I don't know if they're going to stack or how they're going to work. You first have arcing support. The supported skill can hit multiple enemies, and keep in mind, all of these can be ranked up to 10, so all of these are going to have, I think, linear scaling as they're being leveled up. Then you have multi-shot support. Supported projectile skills launch multiple projectiles, so now it's going to be just launching tons of projectiles, and I think this goes up to 11. Then you have piercing support. The supported projectile skill will pierce multiple enemies. So depending on which skills you can mix these with, and if you can mix them together, because certain skills can only be matched with certain governing stones some of the time, if any of these are actually able to be combined, I'm curious on what kind of AoE that's actually going to generate, because if you could say mix multi-shot where you could shoot out 12 projectiles, then you have like mixed with arcing support. The supported skill can hit multiple enemies, leveled up to 10, so it's going to be able to hit like 10 more enemies. You can now be shooting out like 12 projectiles that could all pierce 12 different targets or something like that, and depending on how everything can mix together, we could actually see some pretty ridiculous combinations, especially with the damaging abilities. After seeing some of the stuff they showed in the live stream, and after looking over some of the abilities, and with knowing how the Seneschal scales, I think the damaging abilities are actually going to be the coolest part of the Seneschal. I think the support ones are actually going to be kind of boring and seeming to be kind of weak compared to the damaging abilities. And then it's also going to be pretty crazy when you're mixing those different arcing support tuning gems that can hit tons of different targets, can shoot out tons of different projectiles, and if you mix that with the different elemental support tuning gems. So you have one for every element. You have poison support, which changes a portion of the damage of that ability to poison damage, and that poison damage is a dot, so that can synergize with a lot of your passives as the player, and that poison actually has a chance to spread to different enemies. Then you have the electrocute one we went over where a portion becomes lightning damage. All that lightning damage can also stun, so that can get crazy when you're shooting out 12 projectiles and they're possibly piercing everything. Then you have bleeding support, which turns a portion of the damage to a bleeding over time, and pretty interestingly, this bleeding support also makes enemies take more bleeding damage while they're moving, which could be pretty crazy. You could potentially have some weird bleeding build where you bleed everything with massive bleeds and then run away. That could actually be good maybe for speed farming. You have big AoE bleeds, you AoE bleed everything. You have your Seneschal have massive AoE bleeds, and then you just keep running as they follow you and take a bunch more damage and just bleed out over time following you. So there are some pretty ridiculous combinations coming with this. Well, that's pretty much all I wanted to go over for the Seneschal companion for Season 3 of Diablo 4. I'm very excited for this. This is much more along the lines of a system I want for seasons. I think the complexity of the progression system for each season has gotten more and more complex. Season 1 was kind of boring. Season 2, it got a bit more complex. And then this season, I think we'll just have hundreds or possibly thousands of additional combinations you could possibly do. So it's getting a pretty massive leap in possibilities and complexity and depth. So I hope they keep going along these lines, making the progression systems of the season much more interesting and have a lot more depth. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.